down as soon as I sit down.
Performance, yes, okay. So we're beginning to do some sound testing. Is that okay? That's about right? All right.
So I wanted things to be adjusted and comfortable for you, but you're going to speak third?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So, you guys want to just make sure you're really addressing the mic?
Sure. I have a kind of I can
Yeah, that's perfect
project.
for you.
So okay.
You look taller though. we'll work with it as we go.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
So yeah, that's going to be from here. Unless you're both comfortable coming to the podium.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Saul Halfon. I'm the Department Chair of Science, Technology, and Society, and I'm very excited to introduce this year's Burian-McNabb Lecture. Since 2003, the Burian-McNabb Lecture has been held in honor of our illustrious colleagues, Richard Burian, who is professor in philosophy and science, technology, and society.
Pause for a second. They can't hear on Zoom. Sorry.
Are we good? Okay. So I was just saying, since 2003, the Burian-McNabb Lecture, annual lecture, has been held in honor of our illustrious colleagues, Richard Burian, who is a professor in philosophy and science, technology, and society, and Anne McNabb, a professor of biology, and she was also the associate dean of the graduate school. Now retired, they both remain vibrant scholars and always gracious colleagues. And in fact, they will be holding a reception at their house this evening. So we will give some more information at the end, so stick around. This lecture series invites prominent scholars who are rooted in the history and philosophy of biology, but whose work can speak to faculty and students beyond a narrow disciplinary community. We've had an illustrious parade of scholars over the years, and this year very much lives up to that history. So I will hand things over to Dick Burian, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
I apologize for reading off my computer, but my printer, my wireless stuff broke down, and I don't have any other text but on the computer. Janet Browne is a distinguished historian of science whose research has focused mainly on the biological sciences, but more than that. She earned her BA studying natural history at Trinity College in Dublin in 1972, and her MA and PhD at Imperial College in London. She was there from, I think, 1972 to 1978. From 1979 to 2006, she held numerous positions in Britain. These included positions as reader, lecturer, and or professor in the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine, University College London, King's College Cambridge, rather distinguished places. Beginning in 1983, she was also the associate editor, and from 2008 to 2012, senior editor of the Darwin Correspondence Project, quite an important job. Her recent retirement, she retired recently. She came to the United States in 2006, and she came as the Aramont Professor of History of Science. And her position was in the Department of the History of Science, which she chaired from 2010 to 2017. Throughout her career, she's been very active in professional societies, and she did a lot of work to foster their missions and to make them improve how they worked. She also did a lot of teaching from professional societies. A lot of teaching beyond just narrow historical topics. From undergraduate to advanced graduate levels, and also some teaching in various public institutions in pre-college courses. She was an advocate for broader knowledge of the history of science and its importance to the wider public. She's received a great many awards and wide recognition for the excellence of her work, but it's not worth by taking the time to say more about that. I should welcome her to provide us her lecture.
Well, thank you, Dick, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me. The invitation to visit, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've been wanting to come for a long time, and rather foolishly, I waited for an invite instead of just coming. But I'm honored to deliver this special lecture. I've admired Dick for a long time, and it's extra special for me to be here. And I'd like to thank Oliver and all the other people who have made it possible for me to visit and make it all possible. So this is the title of my talk. No, it isn't the title of my talk. Here is the title of my talk. These images will perhaps be familiar to you. Certainly we all know Darwin. Here he is just arrived back from the Beagle voyage in the early years of the 19th century. You might recognize the Finches image, which is what I'm going to talk about today, but you may not recognize the third image, which is of David Lack, the biologist in the 1930s and 40s, who I'm also going to talk about. Oops, dear, oh dear. Oh, dear, oh dear. Sorry, folks. There we go, this one. So, last month in the UK, more than 100 people dressed up as Charles Darwin to protest at the proposed felling of a historic oak tree close to his parental home in Shrewsbury in the UK. And here we have some of them. The protest didn't succeed in changing the route of the new road, but the participants did manage to set a record for the most Darwins in one place ever gathered, 101. So the British love of dressing up was very much on show. There were plenty of Emma Darwins, his wife, as well, some carrying suitably dressed Victorian babies. And I rather wish I'd been there. So clearly, Darwin is not just a historical figure, but also a present-day hero who is remembered and utilized and means things to people in an astonishing variety of ways. For example, his photograph or his image hangs on the walls of many biological laboratories. Here we've got Istanbul, Naples, and Oxford. And there are many statues and other kinds of visual imagery relating to him all over the world. Here is just three that I picked off the web. The one in the Natural History Museum in London is probably well known to you, and perhaps the one in Turin as well, a fresco. But the one on San Cristobal in the Galapagos is a new one made of fiberglass that is rather strange. So I put that up as well for you. He's represented all over the world. You will know that. Here he is at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, sculptured by Pablo Eduardo. And it's quite a fine image, but you'll see there's a finch perpetuating the legend of the finch on his staff. He's on British, or was on the British £10 note for many years. He's been taken away now by Jane Austen. There are many T-shirts and other kinds of commodification that is very widely distributed. And what I'm going to talk about today is this image of the finch that has become very important. Perhaps I could mention to you as well, as one of the things that I'm doing is to write a study of the afterlives of Darwin, the way that he'd been picked up and turned into all kinds of different sorts of image, and more than just images. His theories have percolated academic fields as diverse as economics, literary criticism, psychology, art history, sociology, even reaching the Australian racetrack, where a horse named Natural Selection ran 3 or 4 times in 2015, but unsuccessfully. So what is a historian or a sociologist to make of these high levels of cultural visibility? Of course, the theory of evolution by natural selection that he and Wallace simultaneously proposed in 1858 stands firm as the basis of modern biology. Daniel Dennett calls the idea, natural selection, the best idea anybody ever had. And despite the hyperbole, countless evolutionary biologists agree. It's indeed remarkable, it's simple, demonstrably effective, and can explain almost anything. And furthermore, the general claim that living beings change and evolve, while not new with either Darwin or Wallace, was thrust into the center of attention with the publication of Darwin's book on the origin of species, and is readily acknowledged then and now as a crucial turn towards secular modernity in science and culture. So there are plenty of reasons to honor Darwin's name, but what interests me more in the historical sense is the way he's come to represent a whole constellation of additional phenomena, some of which were significant in his own time and remain so, and others that have emerged subsequently. The figure of Darwin stands today, and yesterday, for the power of scientific rationality. He symbolizes the victory of science over religion. He serves nationalistic functions in that his time on the Beagle voyage is turned into books and YouTubes that praise British expeditions and reify his collections. His name embellishes numerous museum buildings. His body is fought over by medical practitioners who want to diagnose the diseases he had. And the most recent proposal is a mitochondrial disorder, which is looking good. And there's a rising feeling that he was an agent of empire, a rich white male who appropriated the natural resources of developing countries and generated racist and patriarchal views of devastating consequence. And on the other hand, he's also used as an emblem of all that is good about the scientific mind, the spirit of inquiry, the love for nature, his modesty, and dogged persistence. So, as the 101 Darwins, not Dalmatians, Darwins, gathered in Shrewsbury suggest, he can equally well be an icon for rural preservation. So it's a very flexible legacy, which is what I'm currently studying. Like Einstein, Marie Curie, Newton, Franklin, Pasteur, Freud, Oppenheimer, and many others, Darwin's ideas have become embedded in our narratives about modernity and have been a vital component in the dissemination of Western science across the globe. Even though Bruno Latour reminds us that the individual is not a particularly useful unit of analysis, this advice perhaps does not apply to the construction and constant reshaping of the history of science's global storyline. So it's appropriate, at least to me, to consider Darwin's posthumous fame as something that needs to be problematized and historicized. I mean here the management and use of his intellectual legacy, the commemorations, the mythologizing, the statues, the portraits and biographies, the T-shirts, all the wider problems of reputation in science that interweave nationalism, globalization, commodification, and the media. So Alan Friedman and Carol Donnelly pioneered this approach in 1985, a long time ago, in Einstein, Myth and Muse, followed by Jerry Geeson's Pasteur and several others since then. It's an approach more often encountered in literary studies. For instance, Stephen Greenblatt on Making Shakespeare, Peter Ackroyd on Dickens's Self-Construction, and essays, books on Charlotte Bronte's novels as they appear and reappear in modern fiction, cinema, television, and the stage. So Anne Rigney, a literary scholar, captures the point very nicely in her book on the author Sir Walter Scott by calling it Memory on the Move. And I'm trying to write a study along these lines. It's what my family call the T-shirt view of history. And today I aim to look at the Galapagos finches and how they contribute to Darwin's legacy, as this image suggests. We go back to thank you very much. It sits at the heart of my story today. It's recognizably one of the most iconic representations of organic relationships in Darwin's work. I don't wish at the moment to call it a representation of evolution. Second only to the sketch of an evolutionary tree, which we all know, that Darwin drew in an early notebook, which is depicted on the right here. That's the notebook which had been missing from Cambridge University Library for 20 years until the librarian, whose shoulder is in this picture, put out a police alert on it, and it was returned last year untouched. It's amazing. It's just that it just was given back. But you will see the tree on the left. It's very famous and is repeated all over the world on different kinds of materials and in different sorts of books. But the Finches is the second most well-known. These Finches. Hardly anyone stops to think about this image. I'm very grateful here to Julia Voss, who has written about Darwin's imagery. This was published in the second edition of Darwin's Journal of Researches in 1845 by the London publisher John Murray. It's a wood engraving in diagrammatic form representing 4 of the 13 Galapagos finches as collected by Darwin during the Beagle voyage, positioned in a series to show differently sized beaks from heavy to pointed and numbered 1 to 4. Darwin's text makes the point that these are closely related organisms living in the same restricted area. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. And that combination of image and text is widely acknowledged to be Darwin's first public hint about his evolutionary theory, a testing of the waters, so to speak. And what I'd like to do now is to say a little bit about the making of this image and then turn to its continued life in the history of biology. It's a good example of what Daston and Gallison call mechanical objectivity. It's a wood engraving made according to Darwin's instructions by James Lee, a relatively unknown engraver of topographical and natural history material who lived in London. Lee had already worked on the illustrations for Darwin's geological books and for other geologists whom Darwin knew in London. He copied the finches' heads from illustrations which were already published in one of Darwin's earlier books, The Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. Presumably they were traced in outline and then transferred to a wood block for engraving. They're not the individualized specimens as depicted in the original illustrations, which I'll show you in a moment. Instead, they're converted into diagrams, a format that was then believed to convey scientific facts without mediation. So Lee's intervention was kind of passed over. No mediation between nature and the viewer. A special way of seeing of the mid-Victorian years that was imagined to foster the truths of nature that Darwin was attempting to show. Simple lines and shading reduced the individuality of the original illustrations to a standardized form that can be arranged, as they are here, to make a particular point. So to backtrack a bit, the original illustrations were made for Darwin's Zoology of the Beagle. That volume was issued in 5 parts in 1838 to 1843, each part written by a different expert to provide taxonomic descriptions of the new species collected by Darwin, accompanied by lithographs, many of them hand-coloured. The illustrations depicted the type specimens described in the letterpress. An illustration, you probably know, doesn't count as a type specimen, but it is very handy for people who have the letterpress to determine a type. And Darwin received a government grant of £1,000 to pay for the plates. And the bird volume was authored by John Gould, who is here with real Darwin's finches from the British Natural History Museum. And as Frank Sulloway has described in detail, when Darwin returned from the Beagle voyage, he gave all his bird specimens to John Gould, who you see here, at the Zoological Society of London to identify. And Gould's discussions with Gould in the early weeks of 1837 and Gould's prompt announcement of the new species at meetings of the Zoological Society brought Darwin face to face with the possibility of evolution. One strange thing is that Gould didn't have any similar doubts himself. He remained a creationist even after The Origin of Species was published. But his discussions with Darwin pushed Darwin into very deep and anxious consideration of evolution of some kind. And by July 1837, he was convinced that some sort of evolution had taken place, and he opened his first notebook to record his thoughts, which we saw a moment ago. So John Gould didn't finish those descriptions of Darwin's birds because he and his wife departed on an expedition to Australia in 1838, a grueling trip that allowed them to collect and draw and eventually publish the book that made Gould into one of the most well-known ornithologists of the era. And Gould's successive bird volumes had a very large role to play in confirming the centrality of the collecting and naming enterprise for the British Empire and rivaled those of Audubon. And while they were away, Darwin had to ask somebody else to finish the letterpress for his zoology. So it was Elizabeth Gould who did the pictures, the drawings for the bird volume. Here she is. It's possibly not her at all. It's a little difficult to know because it was done after her death. It's a posthumous painting by an unknown artist. But nevertheless, the National Library of Australia is convinced that this is Elizabeth Gould, who did all the artwork for John Gould. And some of the things I've been working on beyond this story is that, like many other women in the 18th and 19th century, she provided artwork for her husband, for many others provided them for their fathers, cousins, in the natural history world. And research into Elizabeth Gould reveals a very talented and commercially driven individual who was the motor behind her husband's developing career. But her name hardly ever appears on the plates. They're not on the plates in Darwin's volume. Later, when the Goulds were more financially secure, her role was acknowledged with writing at the bottom of the plate, drawn from nature and on stone by E. Gould. So these are the ones that were not attributed to Elizabeth Gould. These are from Darwin's Birds in the zoology volume. She drew the South American rhea from a few bones. She did it very well. She drew these as well from Darwin's collections. And you'll see that she is really very talented. And here is one from the Australian volume, just to show that she could do spectacular work when she put her efforts into it. The Australia book was tremendously successful. She died in 1841, and after that death, her husband employed other bird artists, but at a cost. He kept the copyright of all the artworks he commissioned, including his wife's, and which, I guess, was a sharp practice that annoyed his contemporaries. I haven't really got enough research to make that claim, so I'm a bit hesitant, but he kept the copyright, nevertheless, for all of the bird prints and illustrations that were done under his publication system. And here's the one that Elizabeth Gould did of the Galapagos finches. Very small, relatively uninteresting birds to draw, with a few twigs and generic backgrounds behind them. apart from the cactus finch with a cactus behind it. They're life-sized and were sketched from stuffed specimens, after which the drawing was transferred by Elizabeth to a lithographic plate, and she'd learnt to do this process, printed and then hand-coloured. It required quite a sympathetic rapport with the habits of birds. So these were the basis for the images made by John Lee, which I've tried to indicate here. The first and the last in the series, I haven't done all four this way. Darwin did not pay any of the Goulds for the use of the originals in this way, so I presume that Lee came to his house, or perhaps to the Linnean Society of London, where there was a copy, to trace these lithographed illustrations, and then took them away to his own workshop to turn into woodcuts. Darwin got the basic idea of rearranging these finches' heads from William Swainson's History and Classification of Birds, 1836. Swainson reduced a whole series of birds' heads into silhouettes to show taxonomic relationships. Now, the intellectual context of this endeavour was, of course, Darwin's developing evolutionary theory. He had discussed the gradation of the beaks, of the finches' beaks, in the first edition of his Journal of Researches, published in 1839, and since then he had come to know a great deal more about the birds and other specimens, not just the Galapagos ones. And at the same time, he was working hard to establish a scientific reputation, publishing primarily as a geologist, and in private was deeply engaged with the question of transmutation. So by 1844, the year before these were published, his thoughts had consolidated sufficiently to write a lengthy essay that he asked his wife to publish if he should die, a request that both indicates his conviction that the theory, if substantiated, would be truly significant, and surely also reveals an underlying fear of publication, coupled with a sense of scientific caution. So when he soon afterwards revised the text of his Journal of Researches for a second edition, he had extra information to add to the text, as well as the newly completed theory of natural selection, fresh in his mind, and at the most obvious level, this finch image can be seen as an unequivocal visual statement of what his views were at that point in time. However, why make an illustration? In the first edition, there were very few, very basic sketches. And I think there are other reasons in play than simply bulking it up to make it more attractive to readers. Firstly, Darwin was told by his friend, the botanist Joseph Hooker, that the species of cacti on the Galapagos were each characteristic of an individual islet, a sort of botanical equivalent of the finches. Fantastic news for Darwin. He already knew that the tortoises had the same kind of geographical distribution, one tortoise, one island. So he was eager to incorporate this new information into the new edition, even though he didn't wish to share an evolutionary interpretation with the public. And secondly, there was another reason, a little more hesitant about this, largely unnoticed in the literature. Darwin was probably responding to Robert Chambers's anonymous text, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in 1844, the year before the Finches. And this popular text caught the imagination of thousands of readers, first in Europe and then in the United States. And the anonymous author proposed that new species emerged via jumps or saltations, one formed directly from another, for example, fish becoming reptiles and reptiles becoming birds in the space of a couple of generations. The book was derivative, it was a journalistic account, rounding up contemporary information. And what Chambers had done was taken a lot from Darwin's first edition of the Journal of Researches. And when he read it, Darwin found that the author had used his own information to support the idea of evolution by jumps, which is not what Darwin thought, and also it was not exactly plagiarism, but it was using information that Darwin thought was his. He had been to the Galapagos. Mr. Vestiges hadn't. So I think it's possible that Darwin partly constructed that Finch image for the second edition of his volume as a visual riposte to the Vestiges' focus on saltation. It's easy to see that Darwin's picture and the words emphasize gradualism and gradation, one form only slightly diverging from another. So there's two reasons here. I think that Darwin had new things to say about the Galapagos, and he wanted to stake a claim over his Galapagos specimens. They were his intellectual property. But these birds, these finches, don't appear in any of Darwin's subsequent published books or manuscripts. Despite all his efforts, as Soloway tells us, he was never able to assign the finches that he had collected to particular islands. And this lack of underlying data precluded his mentioning them as a case study of one species splitting off from another. He soon found that pigeons answered the case more readily and served by analogy as a better example of species formation, and he used pigeons thereafter very extensively. So how did these little birds become Darwin's finches, as commonly understood? It wasn't until 1935, as part of the Anglo-American commemoration of Darwin's first landing on the islands. John Van Wy tells us that the actual expression, Darwin's finches, was coined in 1935 in a short talk by an ornithologist called Percy Lowe, the curator of birds at the London Natural History Museum, who had studied the finches in British collections. And in his talk, Lowe introduced an origin story that has lasted a very long time. He said that Darwin had experienced a eureka moment on the islands on seeing the finches, and Lowe consequently called them Darwin's finches. And as a taxonomist, it must have seemed entirely appropriate to Lowe that such an important biological theory, evolution by natural selection, should have been stimulated by evidence directly derived from living beings. And I make the point really only because Darwin by then, of course, was long dead, but the books about Darwin had taken information from his autobiography that it was really Malthus, reading Malthus, that put him on the road of natural selection. And here we have a biologist saying, it's birds. It's a biological theory. And at the same meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, where Lowe gave these opinions, it was proposed to commemorate Darwin, his visit to the Galapagos, by establishing a biological research station on the islands. It was hoped that the California Academy of Science, that had collected intensively in the Galapagos in 1905, or the American Museum of Natural History in New York, that held the world's most complete collection of Galapagos birds, more than 1,000 specimens. It was hoped that these two might take the initiative on funding, that the Brits were hoping the Americans, before the war, would take the initiative on the funding. And Julian Huxley, the grandchild of Thomas Henry Huxley, in particular, said that he aimed to create a laboratory for evolution. And just a detour for a moment, the Charles Darwin Research Station was established on the island of Santa Cruz some 20 years later in 1959, which was another centenary year for Darwin, and opened in 1964 with UNESCO funds. The Second World War naturally stopped all collecting expeditions in the Galapagos and worldwide, and the islands were used by American forces as a military base to protect the Panama Canal. And in the post-war years, this research station, from the start, held a rather tricky relationship with the state of Ecuador because it provided a site for primarily English-speaking biologists to follow Western scientific research programs, and it was financed by an Anglo-American consortium called the Charles Darwin Foundation, who erected a bust of Darwin on the site with Galapageian animals and birds on a mural behind him. Nowadays, it still includes scientists from around the world, but it is very much an Ecuadorian institution. It's extremely active in Galapageian conservation, especially breeding tortoises for reintroduction. And all these developments, as I'm sure you're aware, need to be re-examined with an eye to cultural dominance. As Diego Quiroga and Ana Sevilla say, the construction of a Eurocentric concept of the Galapagos has been a long-term problem. And it's interesting to see how Darwin and Darwinism are currently downplayed in the Galapagos Islands by the Ecuadorian administration, although the research station has recently commissioned a new statue of Darwin. So going back to 1935 again, the Ecuadorian government declared the region a national park to celebrate Darwin's landing, and gave the American explorer, Victor von Hagen, permission to commemorate Darwin's visit with a bust and a plaque, a bust and a plinth erected near the Beagle's first landing place on Santa Cruz. That's actually San Cristobal. The research station is in Santa Cruz, and Darwin's first landing was at San Cristobal. The plinth has a plaque on it with text by Darwin's last living son, Leonard, the eugenicist, that includes the words, "Thus was started the revolution in thought on this subject, which has since taken place." The sons were very active in promoting their father's legacy, and this was only one of many similar commemorative events, as documented by Marcia Richmond, by Betty Smokovitis, John Van Weihe, and others. And after 1935, with these activities, Darwin's name and the theory of evolution were indisputably linked with the Galapagos archipelago, although not obviously linked to the Finches themselves. Finches became the explicit object of attention in the work of a young Oxford biologist called David Lack, who in 1938 was invited by Julian Huxley, then the Secretary of the Zoological Society of London, to study the finches in their native environment. He was funded for a year's work on the islands. Huxley's plan was to bring the finches into prominence as examples of Darwinian evolution and to integrate their ecology into the new so-called modern synthesis. Famously, the synthesis was the combined work of several notable figures, including Huxley, who felt it was time to amalgamate the several branches of biology that had grown up alongside classical Darwinism: genetics, population ecology, paleontology. To these modern biologists, species change was best seen as a process involving change in gene pools and therefore in populations of organisms. It united the broad-scale organismic evolution seen by paleontologists and taxonomists with the small-scale movement of genes in local populations. So in his public talks around now and in several biographies of Darwin and his grandfather Huxley, Julian Huxley paved the way for future biologists to signal their unification in a modern synthesis by venerating Darwin as an ancestor figure. So David Lack was expected to decide if the finches were a taxonomic swarm, freely interbreeding, as is now known to be the case, and kept separate by occupying different ecological niches and eating different kinds of seeds. After his fieldwork, Lack studied the collections at the California Academy of Sciences and the American Museum of Natural History, where he was mentored by Ernst Mayr, who was then working on his biological species concept. When war broke out, Lack was called up and returned to Britain. His first book about the finches wasn't published until 1945, and by 1947 he had rethought his data and had sufficient additional details for another edition in which he emphasized the beaks as a visual demonstration of ecological specialization. He adopted Ernst Mayer's species concept based on reproductive and ecological isolation and retitled his book Darwin's Finches. That's 1947. And the expression stuck. So today, the finches appear in many guises. On the top left, that's a spread from a textbook, the mug we could all buy if we wished, and it's a tattoo on the right. Really quite striking tattoo of someone's arm. They're best known to science, the finches, best known to science as the objects of long-term fieldwork conducted by Peter and Rosemary Grant, and described in the book by Jonathan Weiner, The Beak of the Finch. Recently, and very recently, it's become possible to decipher the genetics of the beak formation, some of the work being carried out at Harvard. And genomic data reveals that the birds have been crossbreeding throughout history. These little birds are a textbook example of adaptive radiation in which a single ancestor responds to selective pressures, in this case food availability, by diversifying into several species. So the finch image that I've been discussing of graduated beaks still carries explanatory weight in modern accounts of evolution by natural selection. The theory behind it has changed, but the picture still conveys the same point. So what can we gather from all this? Why have I put it all together today? I've hoped to interlace the history of an image with some of the changing intellectual framework that accompanied it, as well as the impact of commemorations after it had been published, after Darwin's death. So this story about finches is part of a larger narrative about the construction of legends. And a growing number of historians of science have begun to investigate the cultural processes that are involved when scientists are transformed into international figureheads, such as Darwin, Newton, whatever. And in Darwin's case, this isn't so much a question of asking which of his ideas are still current, or even to carry out a close study of the rise and fall of evolutionary theory in general. Many fine historians, including our host, Dick Burian, have attended to the history of evolution and have shown how there were plenty of other developmental theories around, not least the proposals of Herbert Spencer, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Robert Chambers, to name only the British figures. So I have hoped to add to this marvelous set of historical analyses and resources on evolutionary theory. I've hoped to add to that the investigation of Darwin's afterlives can add to that. So we can add and add. And I think that the investigation of Darwin's afterlives would really reflect the phenomenon that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, memory on the move. So thank you very much. Okay.
So Oliver has a microphone that I guess goes circulate.
Okay, you have a mic.
So if you
Mike,
want
Oliver, why don't you run the room and I'll do Zoom.
okay, cool. So if you want to talk, ask a question, please raise your hand, and I'll come around with the microphone. Does anyone in the room have questions? Amazing.
Thank you. So I was very interested in hearing about how the Finches story in many ways became famous long after it happened. But you did mention that even though Darwin used the pigeons much more extensively in his own work, that was sort of an insight that came later. So I was wondering if it's accurate in your opinion that, the sort of the first idea of evolution and gradual transformation did come from that Beagle voyage, or do you think that's also myth making?
No, that's not myth-making. There's no question of doubt that examining the finches in particular, after Gould had shown him that they were species, they weren't varieties, as Darwin had thought, that tipped him over after he had, on the voyage itself, the last year and a half of the voyage itself, he had been puzzling about the way the organisms looked. Why were some here and some there and they all looked the same? So there's no question that the voyage alerted him to the possibility of evolutionary change. He had books that told him that on the library, on the Beagle, in the Beagle's library. But I think historians are unanimous after Frank Soloway's work, which was very detailed, that it was the finches and Gould's description of the finches that stimulated him to think there really was a possibility of evolution, and he opened up his notebooks. So those notebooks, he's exploring the idea of evolution. He's probably quite committed to the idea of evolution, but he has no mechanism for it. He doesn't have a mechanism for a year and a half after he opened the first notebook, the one that I showed on the screen. But during that year and a half, he became much more committed to the idea. He really thought it was true in the way that scientists did in those days. He thought he'd uncovered a truth of nature, but he didn't know how it worked, how it could happen, which is what he found, according to him, in Malthus. So I thought it was rather a neat point that Percy Lowe had to make, that it was really the finches. Yes.
Thank you. It's really a wonderful talk. I'm really struck by this moment in 1935 as well, and particularly this what Latour would call a kind of purification of science. And at precisely the moment that eugenics is really gaining strength, this attempt to move sort of science into a kind of materialist conception away from the kind of political economy of Malthus. And I was just wondering if you could kind of spin out that story a little bit more in terms of how strategic is this? How much is this just sort of changing ideas of what science is and its relationship with sort of the social movements of eugenics and the kind of political economy before that? And I just wanted to hear more about that moment, because I think it's really intriguing.
It's a really interesting question. And I can't say too much about it because I don't know too much about it. I do feel that the biologists at that time, and I'm excluding Huxley here because he was a eugenicist, the biologists were trying to biologize it. The evolutionary theory was about biology. And here's the evidence for it, it's the birds. And I guess there were other points, tortoises. It doesn't have to be Galapagos organisms, but they were very glad that the finches turned up as a possible source for Darwin's theory. I don't think that's conscious, except beyond the way that discipline will consciously try to keep its significance to the fore amongst the wide range of other sciences. So organismic biology, taxonomic biology was at its height at that time. It became much less so with molecular biology in the 50s. There was a fight between organismic and molecular biology in the 50s after the war. But that 30s period, as you very rightly have said, there's the rise of the Third Reich and all the other kinds of eugenical thinkings in which Darwin's sons had played a part. and Julian Huxley was playing a part, and in 1959 he expressly linked Darwin's theories with the progress of mankind. So there's some uncomfortable strains of thought that are being expressed during this time by people who were both biologists and social commentators. Julian Huxley being a noted biologist. And I'm not quite sure that I could link their thoughts about eugenics with their thoughts about the Finches. I can certainly link their thoughts about eugenics with what they thought about Darwin's theory, which they thought it was true, that biology was supporting a social understanding of, an understanding of society, that biology and evolution by natural selection was the natural way to think about societies. So that eugenics and a biologized society, the connections are very clear. I'm not quite sure if I can, at the moment, put the Finches in that story, except for the fact that the biologists like Lowe, the taxonomists, the museum curators, wanted to have something biological as the origin of Darwin's thinking. We can see that in the biographies of the day. And then there was nothing published during the war, and it all starts again in the 50s with another centenary of the origin, 1959. There are different things being celebrated in the 50s. So I realize that's an unsatisfactory answer, but thank you. It's a really good question.
Thank you.
Fascinating history, and I want to embed it a little bit in the history of science, because there's been a gradual evolution from attention primarily to publications and the studies that went into the publications by the individuals and groups who made those publications, to embedding science within philosophical, cultural, sociological, and broader society contexts. And this is part of the move of history of science in that broader direction. How much do you see that history of science as being relevant as a study to embedding what you did do to understanding what's going on and as history of science is changing?
Gosh, thank you. So I'm part of that history of science. And I was, as a young thing, when I began my studies, it was very much the Robert Young view of Darwinism, that Darwin had for too long both been the property of the biologists and was not really thought about sufficiently in the context of even Victorian England. So yes, the history of science has changed very materially, as you yourself know. And I think a huge change for the better. I think it's become much more history rather than necessarily, I mean, of course it's about science, but we're all looking at science as an object, as historians. That seems to me much more satisfactory now than it was in the 50s, I guess. I still read the books from the 50s, but I'm using them now as sources. So thank you. It's an interesting question.
My question is partially prompted by your subtitle. I work in the history of paleoanthropology, where there are hominid fossils that stand as icons today. So could you say something about, for historians of biology, I think much of this coming from the history of natural history, could you speak to historians speaking and investigating more than the history of the scientists and scientific theories, but the role of specimens in telling the history of science?
Yes.
And also sort of, like methodologically and in the history of the discipline, specimens were kind of these taken for granted things that you didn't explore historically. But there seems to be a trend now that one can tell the history of science from the perspective of specimens and not merely the perspective of scientists as actors.
Yes, we can, and it's super interesting. they're not exploring. I'm part of a group of people, there's lots of us, who are really interested in museums and their objects and the process of collecting objects, the structures that facilitate the collection of objects, and then the arrangement. It's rather geeky, but I like classification. And however, historians of science or historians of collections very rarely take the object and look at its chemical composition or explore it as one might if you were a practicing paleobiologist. Historians of collections typically are interested in the process that makes something an object. So you pick up something off the ground and it turns into an object that then has meaning. That's what they're interested in. Where does it go after it's been picked up? It goes into a museum. It goes through several different rooms in a museum with different meanings. So the interest is in the people who make the collections more than the objects themselves. Apart from really odd things like the platypus that has a whole surrounding history of what is it? What is the platypus? That did generate a great deal of discussion. So your paleoanthropological specimens require the investigators to know also about the mineralization of the bones and what the age is, which of course is part of the museum curation of other specimens. But I'm trying to draw a distinction here that the interest of most of the historians of science that I know rests on the social processes that make an object collectible and put it in a museum or whatever, rather than trying to tease out what that object might have meant at the time in its physical properties to the people who were working on it. There's lots of opportunity to merge those two fields. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. So, so the finches are a part of this evolutionary iconography. So, like pigeons, barnacles, and like I was wondering what political work can those icons do for science, because you mentioned like the work of on beaks in Harvard. Like I'm a little bit familiar, and I know that it's like very molecular. Those are like calcium channels, like, and it really like a big stretch. But I saw how like scientists would go on documentaries and like popularize their research as like having direct implication to like the question that Darwin himself posed. But their research in reality is very molecular. Like it sort of serves as a justification for their research. It's easy sell, easy kind of. But yeah, just wondering if you have like any thoughts on like how this iconography can work for science to maybe justify it. Or, yeah, thanks.
Could I answer this in a different sort of way?
Sure.
Because I think the genetics of the beak developments, the individuals who I've met were very insistent that their work was much more meaningful if they were doing it on finches, that they could get the money if they were doing it on finches. They could get the publicity if they were doing it on finches. And the finches are actually really quite interesting, the way they really are hybridizing all over the place. And you can track the gene through. There's a particular hybrid on Daphne major where the Grants work that has been alive for several years now. They call it Big Bird. And there are now some babies, and they can do the genes on that. So it's really quite interesting to see this interplay between how to make something work financially and publicly and really scientifically. So that's not quite what you asked me, I'm sorry, but I think it has interested me. That Darwin, if you put, well, publishers say the same, if you put Darwin in a title, it's going to sell. And so, yes, Dick knows this very well. And so if you put Darwin in a grant application to NSF, it's going to carry some weight. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. A tip for you.
Thank you for a lovely talk. My question has to do with the icon that wasn't, that is the tortoises in the Galapagos.
Oh, yes.
And if I remember correctly, when Darwin was at the Galapagos, he made some observation, or it was brought to his attention that the tortoises were different on different islands. And I'm wondering if he collected in tortoises, and if maybe the fact that he couldn't or chose not to collect tortoises had anything to do with the kind of lack of kind of gravitas or iconography that gets associated with the finch, or if there's something else going on. I mean, birds had been studied a long time. There were a lot of people that were really invested in, kind of taxonomy of birds, like John Gould, and later on, like Ernst Mayr, you mentioned, who is really central to the evolutionary synthesis. I'm wondering if tortoises are just really different, or something, or if you have any thoughts about why not the tortoise instead of the finch.
Thank you. It's a lovely question. I would love it if Darwin had done more with tortoises, because he, as you say, he was told, although I think very casually, but he was told when he was on the islands that the tortoises are recognizably different on different islands, and he and Fitzroy and others went to about 6 different islands, so they could have collected if they had put their minds to it. But they were already known, that those tortoises had already been taxonomically described. So he was tending not to collect too many things that were already known, that were already in his books on the library, on the Beagle, and they're big. So we know that the ship, we think it was Fitzroy who actually picked them up and put them on the ship, that there were about 4 or 5 live tortoises were brought back to Britain. Several died on the voyage back. There are at least 2 that have been tracked through time in England, but they were Fitzroy's rather than Darwin's. And Darwin never had one, despite what lots of newspaper articles say. And he had he had some tortoises drawn for him in the zoology of the Beagle, but they were not new species. So, or at least they actually were new species, but he didn't think they were. So the tortoises never became part of the story in a way that would have been so fascinating if he had collected them, or if he had said something more about them. He does write about them a bit in both of those editions of the journal, says that I had been told that they are different, but he had no evidence to support that.
Another consideration that might have affected that was common knowledge that tortoises were eaten on the ships.
And they were eaten on the ships as well, yes. So you could bring a shell back with you, which they may have done, I don't know. I actually don't know what was in the crates when it came off the Beagle. But there were two little ones that were live that were brought back.
Was it you? Was it Jack or Danielle first? I'm going to go. Sorry.
You should go with Jack first. I think part of Darwin's prevalence in modernity is the fact that he's, as you pointed out, he's come to represent traits that society has deemed as what a good scientist should be, right? He's adventurous, he's observant, he's curious. And along with that is this picture of the finches that you've pointed out that is so prevalent that I don't think any student that has been in an American high school or middle school really has not seen it. To the point where there's a common lab in science education curriculum, at least in the U.S., where there's like objects, and I don't exactly know what it is, but there's like they have like the different shaped beaks, and they have to pick up the different. So seemingly adaptive radiation, right, which can seem like it's this very complicated thing, suddenly becomes simplistic and simplified so that anyone can understand and see what Darwin saw, air quote, if you're watching online. So I guess my question is, what is the relevance that perhaps how has Darwin maintained that mystique in even today when with the understanding that also science education curriculum is also elevating these complicated discoveries into very easily understood concepts that I think even students who have varying viewpoints could still understand and see.
So the question is about the gap between the reality of the theory and what we present to young people
Sure.
to understand.
I guess my assumption being that there's a mythology there, right, that has been built up, and part of that has been built up because of the work that you have shared and you have presumably done as well, right, from into going into Locke and going into all of these other scientists that elevated him in ways that we don't necessarily know. We don't know Locke's name, right? But his work on the Finches was integral to making this picture obviously even more popular than it.
Yes. Yes. Well, his phraseology, the expression Darwin's Finches, has helps any textbook put a picture of Darwin's Finches and call it Darwin's Finches, and it will seem to the people looking at that picture that this is what Darwin saw, the gradation, and that this is the heart of the evolutionary theory. So all of that is not wrong, but it is a simplification, as you so rightly say. I don't know that middle schoolers could cope with the whole of evolutionary theory. It's a very difficult thing. And it's not completely adopted now. We've got many variations on the classical modern synthesis story. But then there are people, I'm afraid, I think badly of Daniel Dennett for this. Dan Dennett will say it's a simple theory, it's beautiful, it's elegant, it's simple. And he talks about selection, which is simple. But that's not the whole story. He's got an enormous book that talks in much more detail where it's not simple. So I feel that it's just a discrepancy, that we have to simplify for students. We have to simplify in anything we do, really, when we're addressing more than ourselves. So I think it's not even going to be appropriate. A teacher will say, well, this is what we know, this is what is happening, but there's a much more complicated story than this. You'll learn about this when you go to college, or whatever. I don't think it's undermining the public's understanding of evolution. I think it's a very necessary simplification, like we get in the newspapers or on the phone all the time. Everything's simplified for public consumption, and then we understand that it's more complicated than that.
Quick follow-up. If the horse's name that you talked about was artificial selection instead of natural selection, would it have won?
No. No, it was a filly, it was a female horse, and it went to produce babies that are all called natural something.
Follow-up to that one.
Yeah. I did do my research on that one.
Thank you so much. I want to join the chorus of folks commending the talk. It was really fascinating and enlightening. I have a question about the sort of role of art in the story that you're telling. I hope I'm correct in suggesting this, and if I'm not, please tell me. But I detected that you were drawing a sort of parallel between the commercial art story of Elizabeth Gould and then some of the creative expressions that you highlighted in the afterlife of Darwin around these finches and around some of these other bird diagrams. And if I'm correct that you were drawing an intentional parallel there, I would just be curious to hear you explore that more and sort of what is the role of creative expression in the sort of story of Darwin, especially in the afterlife.
Well, in the afterlife, there weren't any new specimens to illustrate. So all of the specimens that Darwin wished to have illustrated were, of course, done in his lifetime. And there's a great deal of interest in the artistic arrangement and commissions and follow through that Darwin himself put into action. And there's a very good book on that by Julia Voss. The afterlife of the finches, that little diagram of the 4 Galapagos finches, is very strong, but they're not really changed a great deal. They're coloured sometimes, and somebody, or many people at different stages, redraws them. Sometimes there are more, sometimes there's a full 13 arranged in a circle to show the radiation. Sometimes they're in a line from big beak down to little beak. But it's not terribly inventive. They're remaining within the paradigm, I would have thought. Pigeons, he doesn't illustrate. He illustrates a few pigeons. He gets somebody to draw pigeons, but they're drawn from other plates. The person doesn't come to his house to do life studies or anything. But Darwin was very interventionist by saying, these feathers don't tip quite that way. So he did the same with cats and dogs and various other images that were in his later works. So actually, there's not an artistic tradition there at all, but there is a visual tradition that is explored by Julia Voss rather nicely. And as we know, through the 19th century, the techniques changed very considerably. So at the beginning, we have people like Elizabeth Gould with hand-colored lithographs, very of course, it's mechanized. It's like Benjamin. They are mechanized for reproduction, but they're hand-drawn and then hand-colored. So maybe 500 were produced. And then we go to these woodcuts that are rolled off the press. They're put into the type and just rolled through endlessly. And those finches and the other few diagrams, there's a few geological diagrams in that book, are reproduced a lot. So it's a mechanical tradition, I guess. It's not a terrifically coherent answer. I'm very sorry, but I don't think there's much to be said about Darwin as a promoter of artistic innovation. I'm going to clarify your question.
Janet, that was a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, this is I'm pulling out a little bit. I'm asking you a question as like a social historian of Darwin. And I thought you dealt with the history of colonialism and empire and how this connects to, Darwin's story connects to that, and then also the later 1935 story. There's a kind of through line here. And you also briefly mentioned kind of reactions from post-colonial theorists and others who are kind of criticizing his image. I think last night at dinner you said like undergrads don't want to deal with this guy right now, or whatever. And so I'm just wondering, like, one way to put it is that you can imagine like a new round of history, of Darwin history from a kind of empire and colonial perspective. And you've thought so much about the history of Darwin. I just wondered if you were going to like go at that, like where, like things you might be interested in, or there's like angles that interest you with that story.
what an interesting remark. Thank you. I really and truly think that we're long past the time of just valorizing Darwin's travels, talking about his collections. They're all over the place and how wonderful they are, and putting them in exhibitions, the artworks that you get. It's really time, and it has begun, for scholars, if they're interested in this. Not many people are all that interested in Darwin any longer, but if they're interested in putting one person and a voyage into the framework of British imperialism, it's all there. It's a marvelous story to rethink what they were doing. And that Darwin, as an individual riding a horse across the pampas with a posse of sailors behind him, because Fitzroy didn't allow anyone out alone, or the hired guides that Darwin had. He was a man on a horse, drawing things, writing things, asking questions in Spanish, that is immensely appropriative. And we can put that into some of the new histories of colonization and excursions generally that I think needs to be done. I really do. And I'd like to do it, but, you know, life's only so long. So, thank you.
Yeah, my question is also in these lines. Thank you so much for the talk. I'd like to understand the role of territories in Darwin's work in two ways. One is, why Galapagos? Why was he there? Does this make any difference in the theories that he is building? And in the same line, I would like to understand the role of territory, considering you, situating you as the author, considering the time where we are and all the discussions that we have been having in terms of context, right? Like a bird in Galapagos is one thing. A bird in a museum in Europe signifies another thing. So there is here the role of territory now, too.
Yes.
So if you could talk from your standpoint as well, the role of the territory as you see it from where you are.
Okay, thank you very much. So the Galapagos was on the route of the Beagle voyage as set out by the Admiralty about 5 years previously, in order simply to collect fresh water. There were a few small villages in the Galapagos that sold pigs and goats to sailors who came by. So there was an opportunity to get fresh meat before they sailed through the Pacific. So it was a well-known stopping place for exactly that reason, even to the point that there was a barrel on one of the bays in which people would put letters, and the next ship coming through, French or German or whatever, Spanish, could pick it up and take it onwards through. So that's very definitely, the islands were perceived as a useful facility for European ships and American ships on their way somewhere else through the Pacific. And the captain of the Beagle wanted to stay for 3 weeks so that he could see if there were any decent harbors. They were very well known before the Beagle got there, and they were even better known afterwards. But they were not explored by naturalists. So Darwin had a very empty field in front of him. Anything he collected would be useful and informative. So that's why they were there. It wasn't very long, only 3 weeks. And it was the only isolated archipelago that they stopped at. They went to the Falklands, which is a little less isolated, but the Galapagos was a volcanic archipelago where Darwin thought that he would be able to see how life first arrived, or how living beings first arrived on new land. So there's lots and lots of reasons why that was super interesting for him to call there. As territory, it was Ecuadorian at that point. There was an Ecuadorian governor on the islands. And the Beagle ship had got a passport and a permission from the Spanish ambassador in London to visit various Spanish colonies, and they, as they went all through South America on a Spanish passport, a Portuguese passport for Brazil. So they weren't trying to claim the territory, except in terms that we now can talk about as kind of intellectual. They were collecting things to bring back to Europe to make a claim over the knowledge that was gained from those islands. So that's the kind of territorial acquisition that was in their minds. They weren't putting a British flag up on the islands. And how the territories of history of science relate to me, I'm very interested in territories. I'm not quite sure what it is that you would like me to be responding to. I wrote a book on biogeography once upon a time, which was all about scholars dividing up the world into territories, with drawing boundaries on maps. I personally am a non-boundary person, but I'm not sure if that's what you're asking.
Thank you so much for a really great talk. I learned a lot, and I have my husband has some of these lithographs of these reproductions, so it's great to have some context to it. I was wondering, when we talk about the afterlife, I wanted to take that literally for afterlife, and it struck me as I'm not a scholar of biology, it's energy, but in thinking about collecting this term, I always used to think that it's a very passive activity. Oh, you're just sort of like you're collecting rocks I've collected. But it's quite a violent or it's not a nice process, I guess, of collecting, because you're killing animals, I assume, when you're collecting finches or tortoises or any other kind of animal. So I was wondering that because these illustrations require this process first, this, to collect, and that is what led to, this chain of conceptualizing natural selection. If that, and I don't know if you can answer this, but were there other ways of understanding, this diversity, this plurality we saw, even at that time, that did not require collection? Or was that sort of, I know that's sort of the term, the practice of art right now for everything, but.
That's super interesting. I think you'd find an artist was the only person who could do that without violating the natural world. It was collecting stones or plants was romanticized all through the 18th and 19th century as a very, as a process that was worshipping God as well, that you were being respectful. Darwin didn't worship God and was very respectful, but he was taking everything he could lay his hands on. So I think probably you wouldn't find a scientist or a naturalist doing what you've suggested would be a more appropriate approach towards the natural world. 10, 20 years later, you might. You would have people like Philip Henry Goss, who looked into rock pools and saw an ecosystem and drew it, and then wrote about it as a naturalist. And he may well have plucked one or two anemones out of the pool to see what was inside them, but that's less violent towards nature than the things Darwin did. So thank you, that's a very fascinating question.
Thank you.
Do we have any online?
No, I don't think so. I've been keeping up.
I think we could do one more in the room.
Yeah. Who else?
Nobody wants to send us off with a great question?
One more.
So sorry, I'm gonna go back to the social history of Darwin moving around and empire and colonialism, and this biogeographies thing you brought up. I was wondering if this is something I learned from Henry Coles years ago, was that an idea that I don't know where Henry got it from, but is that Wallace was doing different kinds of work because he's going out and collecting animals and selling them, I think, yes. Right? And because of that, he realized he sees different things like the Wallace line, where he's moving around a lot in that kind of roving way that Darwin wasn't doing. He was a little bit more static. I just wonder if that means Wallace's work, the work he's doing in the kind of colonial imperial thing is leading to different insights. And so, I wonder if it's kind of a question about bringing not just Darwin into that imperial colonial picture, but these other characters too you know so much about.
Yes. So Wallace is always a very fascinating counterpart to Darwin. I think if one was studying Darwin, you should always ask yourself, what did Wallace do in the same situation? And you're quite right, Wallace was traveling both times in Central America and in the Southeast Asia under the imperial endeavour. He was a British person who made use of British contacts throughout Southeast Asia, particularly the Raja of Sarawak, but others as well, and was shipping his materials back to Britain to be sold. So he had quite a strong contact with people in Britain all through his travels because of that. And the money was being saved for him to help finance the travels. This gives me an opportunity to fly a theory of mine that some of what Wallace was doing when he was in Southeast Asia was drawing on what he had read in Darwin's second edition of the Journal of Researches. So Wallace saw that picture of the finches, he read the chapter on the Galapagos about diversification, and he read Chambers's Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, and was a convinced evolutionist before he went out to Southeast Asia. And I think he was putting all these things together, including his own innate brilliance, into a theory that relied on regions, boundaries, areas, which was what he came to believe was his major contribution to science, particularly islands. But if you think of some of the distribution of organisms in Southeast Asia, they are either naturally confined to an island, or they are islands in a larger continental area, little islands of this species, little islands of that species. So islands was what Wallace really took with him to that area. And this is my theory, my Wallace friends really don't like it, is that I think he was encouraged in that way of thinking by finding it in Darwin.
Awesome. And on that note, thank you all, everyone, for coming. This was such a phenomenal talk. Please give another round of applause for Janet Browne. Yes, and thank you to both Anne and Dick, and especially thank you to Dick for introducing Janet. It's wonderful to see you all. And I will remind everyone that there is a reception, just like Saul said, at 5 o'clock at the Burian-McNabb's house. They are gratefully hosting us, and I'm really excited. So come hang out. Next week, we have 2 more seminars in our series for this semester. Next week, we have Taylor Loy. They're both dissertation seminars. We have Taylor Loy, and then we're finishing out the semester with Jack Leff. So thank you all.
Instructions to find our house. See one of us.
Yes. And there's also, I can give you the address, and I can forward the email as well. Thank you all.